in the darkest corners of the Pacific jungle, where the canopy swallows the sunlight and every shadow could hide a rifle, survival wasn't about strength, or numbers, or even rank. It was about clarity. It was about patience. It was about one man's ability to see what others could not. In January of 1943, on a battered island called Guadalcanal, an entire American battalion was being hunted, methodically, silently, by Japanese snipers hidden high in the banyan trees. 14 men died in just 72 hours. Patrols refused to move. Morale fractured. Every rustle in the canopy felt like death itself. And then, into this nightmare, stepped a quiet young lieutenant from Illinois, carrying a rifle his commanders had mocked as a toy. What followed over the next 4 days would become one of the most extraordinary and least told sniper duels of World War II. A duel fought not by a specialized shooter with government-issued optics, but by a civilian marksman with a mail-order Winchester and nerves of absolute steel. This is the story of John B. George, the story of the rifle that changed a battle, and the story of how a single man turned the tide where an entire battalion could not. At 9:17 on the morning of January 22nd, 1943, Second Lieutenant John B. George crouched in the ruins of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz on Guadalcanal. Through a 2.5 power scope, he watched a banyan tree 240 yards away. Somewhere in those heavy branches, a Japanese sniper was waiting for an American to make a mistake. George was 27 years old. Before the war, he'd been an Illinois state rifle champion, the youngest man in the state's history to win the 1,000-yard title back in 1939. Guns magazine. On paper, he was exactly the kind of marksman an army would want when facing enemy snipers. In reality, for his first months in uniform, most of his fellow officers thought his prized rifle was a joke. The rifle wasn't government issue. It was a Winchester Model 70 sporting rifle with a Lyman Alaskan scope mounted in a Griffin & Howe side mount, the kind of rifle a serious civilian shooter would save for years to buy. George had done exactly that, putting away 2 years of National Guard pay to purchase it in peacetime. When the rifle arrived at Camp Forest, Tennessee, the armorer eyed it skeptically. "Is that for deer?" he asked. "Or for Germans?" George answered simply, it was for the Japanese. But before he could prove his point, the war moved faster than the mail. His unit shipped out to the Pacific, while his rifle sat in a warehouse back in Illinois. George spent the long voyage to the Solomon Islands, watching other men strip and clean their standard-issue M1 Garand rifles, while the weapon he trusted most was half a world away. The Garand, the workhorse of the U.S. Army, weighed about 912 pounds loaded, fed from an 8-round en-bloc clip, and fired .30-06 military ball ammunition as fast as a man could pull the trigger. George's Winchester weighed about 9 pounds, with another 12 ounces for the scope. It was a bolt action, 5 rounds, no bayonet, no official place in the tables of organization. When the Winchester finally caught up with him in late December 1942, it arrived in a wooden crate, stamped fragile. A supply sergeant handed it over like it was a phonograph, not a weapon. Inside, wrapped in cosmoline, was the rifle George had been thinking about since he boarded the ship. His captain was unimpressed. "Leave the sporting rifle in your tent," Captain Morris told him. "Carry a real weapon." George carried both. By the time the 132nd Infantry Regiment of the American Division relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December, the island had already become one of the most bitterly contested pieces of ground in the Pacific. The Marines had landed in August 1942, and against the odds, seized and held Henderson Field. They had beaten back Japanese attacks by sea and by land, but vital terrain remained in enemy hands. The Japanese still held strong positions on Mount Austin, and in the fortified complex the Americans nicknamed the Gifu, a labyrinth of bunkers, caves, and interlocking defenses designed by experienced engineers and manned by determined troops. George's battalion was part of the push to break those positions. On December 17, 1942, they attacked the western slopes of Mount Austin. For 16 days they fought in jungle, mud, and narrow fire lanes cut by machine gun and mortar fire. By January 2nd, they had taken their objectives, but at a cost: 34 men killed and 279 wounded. In all of that fighting, the Winchester Model 70 fired exactly 0 shots in anger. The nature of the terrain and the order of battle favored massed infantry and artillery, not a lone rifleman. Bunkers had to be reduced by grenades, satchel charges, and flamethrowers. Targets were often visible only for seconds, if at all. The Garand, with its 8-round clip and rapid fire, was king. The Winchester stayed strapped to George's back or leaned in a corner of a muddy foxhole, an oddity no one quite knew what to do with. Then the battalion moved west, toward Point Cruz and the coastal groves of coconut and banyan trees beyond the Matanikau River. The terrain changed. So did the war. Out in the groves, there were no long bunker lines, no fixed fortifications carved into hillsides. The Japanese, who had been pushed back from Henderson Field and Mount Austin, didn't vanish. They retreated to ground they knew intimately, the thick jungle and towering trees of the coastal belt. They dug shallow pits, camouflaged hides, and, most importantly, climbed. Some of those men were snipers, equipped with scoped Arisaka rifles and years of experience in the jungle. They learned the American movement patterns quickly: trails, water points, habitual routes between company positions. These became killing zones. On January 19th, a sniper shot and killed Corporal Davis while he was filling canteens at a creek. On the 20th, another sniper picked off 2 men from L Company during a routine patrol. On the 21st, 3 more men died. One of them was hit cleanly through the neck. From a tree the patrol had already walked past twice. In 72 hours, 11 Japanese snipers working the groves west of Point Cruz had killed 14 Americans from the 132nd Infantry. The casualty rate from sniping was outpacing malaria. That evening, the battalion commander sent for George. The meeting was brief and to the point. The colonel wanted to know if that mail-order sweetheart, the Winchester everyone joked about, could actually do anything more than win civilian trophies. George explained quietly and without bravado that he hadn't just dabbled in competitive shooting. Before the war, he had fired 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights and had won the Illinois 1,000-yard championship in 1939, the youngest man ever to do so. He knew what the rifle could do. He knew what he could do. The colonel gave him until morning. At dawn on January 22nd, 1943, George crawled into the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. It overlooked the coconut and banyan groves, where intelligence believed the enemy snipers operated. He had no spotter, no radio man, no security element, just his Winchester, a canteen, and 60 rounds of .30-06 ammunition loaded on stripper clips, the same military ball cartridge the Garand fired. He wiped away any remaining cosmoline from the rifle and rechecked the scope mounts. The Lyman Alaskan optic seemed almost modest at 2.5 power magnification, but to a trained eye, that was enough to catch small movements in a jungle that never stopped twitching and rustling. Then he settled in, elbows braced, rifle steady, and began to glass the trees, slowly, methodically, left to right, top to bottom. At 9:17, he saw the branch move. There was no wind. In the last part, we left John George alone in a captured bunker, watching the banyan trees near Point Cruz through a low-powered scope, searching for the snipers who had bled his battalion for 3 days. It was January 22nd, 1943. His commanders were skeptical. His rifle was unproven. His men were dying. Then a branch, 87 feet above the jungle floor, shifted without a breath of wind. Through the green haze, George picked out a shape. A man in dark clothing, tucked into a fork, where several thick limbs converged. The sniper was facing east, his Arisaka trained on a supply trail the Americans had been using. From that perch, he could watch the approach routes, pick his shot, and vanish back into the foliage. George adjusted for the barest hint of wind. 2 clicks on the scope's elevation drum. He slowed his breathing, let the world narrow down to the crosshairs on that single, barely visible silhouette. The trigger on the Winchester broke like glass at about 3 pounds, just as he had tuned it in countless hours on U.S. ranges before the war. He squeezed. The rifle recoiled. The report cracked across the groves. In the banyan, the dark shape jerked violently and fell, crashing through the branches, tumbling nearly 90 feet to the ground. 1 shot, 1 sniper dead. George worked the bolt, ejected the spent brass, and reloaded without taking his eye off the tree. Japanese doctrine often paired snipers, 1 shooter, 1 observer. If the man he'd just killed was the trigger puller, his partner was nearby. The jungle looked unchanged. Birds still called. Insects still buzzed. Artillery rumbled faintly miles away. But somewhere out there, another set of eyes was searching, trying to understand what had just happened. George began scanning again. At 9:43, he found the second sniper, about 60 yards north of the first tree. This man had chosen a lower position, maybe 50 feet up, and was moving down the trunk. He'd heard the shot. He knew the position had been compromised. George led the motion slightly, aimed where the man would be, and fired. The second sniper fell backwards out of the tree, his rifle rattling through the branches ahead of him. When both bodies hit the ground, the grove went still again. 2 shots, 2 confirmed kills. Word spread quickly through the battalion's lines. The toy rifle had just accomplished more in a few hours than days of blind patrols and return fire had managed. But in his bunker, George refused spectators. Curious officers and enlisted men wanted to come watch. He turned them away. Extra movement meant extra noise. Extra noise meant attention. Attention in a sniper duel meant death. By 11:21, the Japanese had adjusted. A bullet slammed into a sandbag just 6 inches from George's head, blasting his face with dirt. He dropped flat against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, a new angle, a new tree. He waited 3 full minutes before easing back into position. The sniper who had fired at him had followed textbook doctrine: shoot, then relocate. In a jungle as dense as Guadalcanal's, though, relocation was constrained. There were only so many suitable trees with the right angles of fire. At 11:38, George picked him out. 3rd tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, about 73 feet up. The man had moved to a different branch, but not a different trunk. To a lesser marksman, the change might have been confusing. To George, it was a mistake. He fired. The 3rd sniper slid silently from his perch and vanished into the canopy. By noon, George had killed 5 snipers. Each kill represented not just a dead enemy, but the removal of a specific, targeted threat to his own men. Each one also increased the Japanese determination to find and eliminate the lone rifleman in the bunker. By early afternoon, their response changed from individual counter-sniping to something more blunt. At 09:57, the next morning, but we'll come to that, they would open up with mortars. For now, on this first day, George kept working methodically, watching for the subtle betrayals that separated living predators from inanimate jungle. But the Japanese were adaptive. After their 5th man died, the remaining snipers stopped shifting during the day. They learned that even the smallest movement, a head turn, a weight shift on a branch, could give away their position to an enemy who knew how to read the canopy. For the rest of the afternoon, George watched trees that might as well have been carved out of stone. The Lyman Alaskan's modest magnification made identification difficult. Shadows and leaves merged into amorphous shapes. Without motion, even a human body could disappear in the patterns. By 16 hours, he pulled back to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The sarcasm was gone from his voice. In a single day, George had dramatically reduced the sniper threat and proved decisively that his civilian rifle was anything but a toy. Morris wanted him back in position at dawn. January 23rd began with a tropical downpour. Rain hammered the canopy, turning the ground into a swamp and slashing visibility to less than 100 yards. For a sniper duel, it was a pause, a reset. No one could see far enough to work. George sat in the bunker again, listening to the rain drum on shattered logs and rusted metal. At 08:15, the storm began to ease. By 08:45, the groves were visible again, veiled but no longer opaque. And somewhere out there, surviving Japanese marksmen were climbing. When the 6th sniper of the campaign revealed himself, it was at 09:12. Farther out this time, roughly 290 yards away. The Japanese had watched the previous day and understood at least part of George's capabilities. Longer range, more concealment, better angles. George compensated for distance, held carefully, and fired. The 6th man fell. It should have been a quiet, personal killing. Just another precise shot in a contest of patience and skill. Instead, it triggered the most violent response yet. At 09:57, Japanese mortars began bracketing the bunker. The first salvo landed short, maybe 40 yards out. The second walked closer, 20 yards. George didn't wait for the third. He grabbed his rifle and sprinted north along the tree line, diving into a shell crater just as the next volleys slammed into the earth, where he'd been lying moments before. The bunker disintegrated in blasts of mud, sandbags, and shattered timbers. When the barrage lifted, he crawled out of the crater and found a new position behind a fallen tree about 120 yards north of the ruins. It was less comfortable, less prepared, but it had 2 big advantages: cover and a clear view into the groves. The duel continued. By late afternoon, George had killed 2 more Japanese snipers, numbers 7 and 8. One of them perched so high that the changing angle of the sun briefly silhouetted him against the sky, turning perfect concealment into a fatal outline. At 17:00, after 9 hours in the field, a runner arrived from Captain Morris. Headquarters wanted a tally. George's report was simple: 8 confirmed sniper kills in 2 days, 12 shots fired, 8 hits, 4 misses. Morris's orders were just as simple: be back in position at dawn on January 24th. That night, in his tent, George cleaned the Winchester as carefully as he had the first day he'd uncrated it. He ran patches through the barrel until they came out clean, checked the scope mounts, and loaded 5 fresh rounds into the magazine. He also did the cold math. Intelligence estimated that 11 Japanese snipers had been operating in the Point Cruz groves when the killing began. 8 were now dead. That left 3. The 3 who had survived longest. The 3 who had watched their comrades die over the last 48 hours. The 3 who now knew, at least in outline, who and what they were up against. An American officer with a distinctive rifle and a demonstrated ability to spot movement most men would miss. At 03 hours, after hours of trying to sleep, George gave up. He sat in the dark with the Winchester across his lap, listening to the tropical night. Previously, we watched John George cut the Japanese sniper force in the Point Cruz groves from 11 down to 3 in just 2 days, surviving mortar fire and constant counter-sniping. Now, on January 24th, 1943, the duel enters its most dangerous phase. The remaining enemy marksmen know he exists. They know roughly where he works, and they are willing to use themselves as bait to kill him. The dawn on January 24th was a gray smear of rain and low clouds. By 05:30, the downpour was heavy enough to obscure the groves almost entirely. Any pre-planned sniper operations would be delayed. You can't shoot what you can't see. George used the weather to move again. Returning to either the destroyed bunker or the fallen tree would have been predictable. Predictable was deadly. Instead, he chose a cluster of large rocks 70 yards south of his previous positions, a spot the Marines had once used as a machine gun nest. The rocks gave him elevation and overlapping fields of fire into the groves, along with solid cover. He settled in, waited for the rain to slacken, and began glassing the trees as visibility slowly improved. At 08:17, he spotted sniper number 9. This man was in a palm tree, about 190 yards out and only 40 feet up, unusually low for a sniper, especially after 2 days of lethal counter-fire. Most marksmen sought height for better observation and longer lines of sight, but here the palm's fronds created a natural hide. From ground level, the sniper's position would have been almost invisible. From George's slightly elevated position on the rocks, though, he could see enough. The curve of a shoulder, the shadowed suggestion of a head. He centered his crosshairs and began to squeeze the trigger, and stopped. Something felt wrong. After 3 days of hunting and being hunted, patterns had begun to emerge. The surviving Japanese snipers had shown themselves to be cautious, patient, and alert. This position, by contrast, felt careless, too low, too obvious to someone not approaching from the usual angles. It didn't match the respect he'd developed for his opponents. If the palm sniper was bait, then the real threat would be somewhere nearby with a clear line of fire on anyone who took the shot. George lowered the rifle slightly and expanded his search. For 11 long minutes, he swept every tree within 300 yards of the palm, inch by inch, branch by branch. The jungle became a mosaic of possibilities, dark patches that might be shadows or might be men, limbs that might be logs or might be rifles. At 08:28, he found the real danger. About 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up in a banyan tree, a second sniper lay almost perfectly camouflaged. Vines and branches covered him from 3 sides. From ground level, he would have been invisible. From the rocks, even with the scope, he was hard to pick out. He had a clean line of sight to the fallen tree position George had used the previous day, and to the palm that now held the decoy sniper. He was set to kill anyone who fired at the bait or appeared in the expected firing position. George now had two problems. If he shot at the banyan sniper first, the loud report would immediately reveal that he wasn't where the Japanese expected. The experienced marksman would likely shift, drop, or counter fire before George could work the bolt and make a second shot. If he did nothing, the enemy sniper would eventually notice that the American wasn't behaving as predicted. George chose a third option: use the bait against them. He aimed first at the decoy in the palm. The shot hit. The bait sniper fell. Then George instantly swung his scope back to the banyan, scanning for reaction. The true sniper, hearing the shot and seeing his partner fall, began to turn toward the unexpected source of fire. That movement, just a slight shift of shoulders and head, was all George needed. He fired. The second man tumbled out of his carefully prepared hide, his rifle following him through the branches. 2 shots, 2 more dead, but the price of those clean kills was exposure. Somewhere in the groves, other Japanese observers had heard the shot, seen the palm and the banyan erupt in sudden motion, and noted the new direction of fire. George grabbed his rifle and ammunition and ran. He slid east along the rock line and dropped into a drainage ditch about 40 yards away, pressing himself into the mud. A few seconds later, Japanese machine gun fire chewed the rocks he'd just vacated, kicking up stone splinters and dust. The burst lasted 17 seconds. When it stopped, George counted slowly to 60, waiting for another volley that never came. He moved again, this time to a shell crater roughly 100 yards east. The crater was half filled with rainwater. It was cold, muddy, and miserable, but it offered low, irregular cover and a firing position just high enough to rest the Winchester on the rim. He slid into the water until it reached his chest. 10 confirmed snipers were now dead. If the original estimate of 11 was correct, 1 remained, almost certainly the most cautious and experienced of the group, and now fully aware of George's existence and methods. Hours passed as he scanned the trees, his body slowly chilling in the water. No movement in the canopy betrayed the last sniper. At 0947, George realized his error. He had been looking up, assuming the surviving marksman would follow the same pattern as the others, seeking the safety and field of view of the high branches. But a smart opponent would not be predictable. Movement flickered at the edge of his vision. Low, near the jungle floor, about 60 yards to the south. A shape sliding through ferns and fallen branches, parallel to the tree line. The 11th sniper was on the ground, crawling. He wasn't advancing on the rocks, where George no longer was. He was moving toward George's last known logical refuge, the drainage ditch he had used when machine gun fire had raked the rocks. From the flooded crater, George had a partial view, but the rim limited his firing angle. To get a clean shot, he would have to rise, exposing himself. The crawling sniper halted about 40 yards from the rocks, studying them carefully, rifle ready. After minutes of watching and seeing nothing, he began to move again, creeping forward, 35 yards, 30, 25. He was tracking the path George should have taken when he escaped the machine gun burst. At 10:03, the sniper reached the rocks and slid into the abandoned machine gun nest, adopting a firing position that faced east toward the drainage ditch. From there, he could watch the ditch and the imagined American hiding there. From the flooded crater, George now had a perfect shot at the man's back. 38 yards, center mass, an easy hit for any trained shooter. He didn't take it. The position was too exposed. No experienced sniper would linger in such a precarious spot unless he was confident he was covered. This felt like another bait setup. George searched again. At 10:06, he found a second Japanese soldier about 70 yards northwest of the rocks, lying behind a fallen tree trunk, weapon aimed toward the drainage ditch. Two men, not one. Either both were snipers or the 11th sniper had brought an escort. George couldn't kill both fast enough with a bolt-action rifle before they reacted and returned fire. He needed them to move. Slowly, he slid deeper into the water until only his eyes and the top of his head broke the surface. He pointed the Winchester vertically to keep water out of the barrel and waited. At 10:13, the soldier in the rocks stood up, having seen no movement in the drainage ditch. He signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Together they began a slow sweep eastward, walking parallel to each other, 70 yards apart, trying to flush out the American. They passed, within a short distance of George's flooded crater, without noticing the pair of eyes half submerged in muddy water. When both men had moved past, placing themselves between the crater and the tree line, George rose silently out of the water and brought the Winchester to his shoulder. Water cascaded down the barrel and his uniform. He aimed at the closer soldier, the one who'd been in the rocks, now about 42 yards away. He fired. The man dropped. Working the bolt by instinct, George swung onto the second soldier, who was already turning, rifle rising. George fired again. The second man fell. If the estimate of 11 snipers had been correct, the contest was now over. But the jungle was rarely that simple, and the shots he had just fired had not gone unheard. From the direction of the trees came voices, icking up where we left off. It is January 24th, 1943. Lieutenant John B. George has systematically neutralized 10 of the 11 Japanese sniper threats operating in the banyan-lined groves west of Point Cruz on Guadalcanal. After 3 days of methodical stalk-and-shoot operations, he is now engaged in a desperate close-range fight when the remaining sniper's support element closes in. George's last confirmed sniper shot came from the water-filled shell crater he'd used as a hiding place, but the fragile advantage of surprise had been lost. Voices in Japanese, infantry, not sniper teams, were wheeling around his last known position. George realized his stalk had flipped into a fight for survival. He submerged himself in the crater until only his eyes and the top of his head showed above the muddy water. His rifle, the Winchester Model 70 he had carried from Tennessee through the Philippines and into the Pacific jungle, was pointed upward to keep the barrel clear of water. Above him, ferns dripped, the heavy canopy muted sound, the rainforest pressed in. He waited. At 10:28, the enemy came. At least 6 Japanese soldiers, possibly more, were advancing through undergrowth toward the 2 knocked-out sniper positions. George's footprints radiated toward the second body. He heard boots crunching, branches snapping, low voices giving orders. They were the recovery team, or perhaps counter-snipers coming to kill the toy rifle man. George dreamed of other options: stay hidden and hope they pass, or fight, with 5 rounds still loaded. But this was no longer a duel of solitary snipers with 5 shooters and 5 targets. It was a small unit contact, and the odds were turning against him. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the lip of the crater, peering down. George fired. The soldier dropped. He chambered another round, rose partly, and fired again at 2 more soldiers who appeared at the rim. Both fell. 2 rounds fired, 3 enemy down. Only 3 rounds remained. The ranch-style wilderness of the jungle, the rifle-stalking tactics, the high branches ambushes, all seemed a world away from this raw firefight. George abandoned his flooded crater position and sprinted 20 yards through undergrowth to a fallen log for cover. Japanese rifle fire cracked around him. The bullets kicked up dirt. The faint smell of cordite mingled with humidity. He scanned his surroundings under scope, saw 2 more soldiers advancing across an open patch about 50 yards away. He fired once. The lead man dropped, the second dove for cover. 2 rounds now gone. The Japanese were flanking him. One group from the south, another from the east. George realized he could not win a firefight with a bolt-action 5-round rifle against multiple opponents, wielding semi-automatic arms and supported by infantry squad tactics. Survival meant withdrawal. He grabbed his rifle, ran, over tangled vines, through mud, dodging falling fronds. He sprinted 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater, dry this time, and pressed himself tight against its wall, his mind locked on the simple mantra: survive. He checked the Winchester, mud on the stock, water in the barrel, worn-looking finish, but it was intact. Down to 2 rounds left and no stripper clips handy. The pack was miles away. The threat was still out there. At 11:13, he reached the American perimeter. The Marine sentry challenged him. George gave his name and unit. The battalion headquarters of the 132nd Infantry Regiment received him without fanfare. Captain Morris demanded a full debrief. George recounted the events. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days using 12 shots. Then a firefight with Japanese infantry, in which 3 more were killed using 5 rounds. At the end he had 2 rounds left, his rifle dirty and wet, his body exhausted. Morris asked for ammunition status, rifle condition. George said functional but needs cleaning. The war for Point Cruz groves was over. Intelligence reported the Japanese snipers operating in that sector had been neutralized or withdrawn. The dense banyan jungle that had claimed 14 American lives in 72 hours was now a zone cleared, at least for now. That night, the rifle cleaning began again. George spent 2 hours field stripping the Winchester Model 70, running patches until the barrel came clean, checking the scope mounts, adjusting eye relief. The rifle had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee to the Pacific, and now through the ruthless jungle of Guadalcanal. Within days, the effects rippled upward. The regimental commander, Colonel Ferry, asked to meet George. They asked a simple question: could he train others to do what he had done? George agreed, but with one non-negotiable stipulation: he would keep the Winchester for himself. The higher command approved. Training began January 27th at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. George had 40 men, all previously qualified as expert marksmen with iron sights. None had served as dedicated sniper shooters in combat. Their rifles, 14 Springfield M1903 or similar, with Unertl scopes. The Winchester remained his personal rifle. George trained them in fundamentals: breathing control, trigger squeeze, reading wind, using terrain. He emphasized adaptation. The jungle rarely provided textbook shooting positions. You had to use logs, rocks, fallen trees, shell holes, drainage ditches, all as makeshift rests. Weight, rifle balance, comfort didn't matter as much as stability and stealth. In 3 days, the men progressed, first shooting stationary targets at 100 to 400 yards, then moving targets partially concealed by vegetation. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 were reliably hitting man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. He divided them into 16 two-man teams, one shooter, one spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and an M1 Garand for security, while the shooter used the scoped rifle. After each kill, the two could swap roles. This prevented reliance on a single shooter and built mutual competence. On February the 1st, George led 4 of the teams into the field. The mission: move west of the Matanika River and clear small Japanese infantry stragglers, no longer snipers, still operating in the coastal jungle. At dawn, the teams moved in. By 07:20, a Japanese soldier appeared on a trail. George's team engaged. 1 shot, 1 kill. Over 6 hours, his team engaged 7 more Japanese. 7 shots, 6 kills, 1 miss. Other teams reported similar results. 23 Japanese killed that day. 0 American casualties. The sniper section's operations continued through early February. By February 9th, the section had achieved at least 74 confirmed kills where bodies were observed. Their operations covered interdicting Japanese evacuation routes, forcing the enemy into the open. Disease, starvation, and the relentless American pressure pushed the Japanese onto ships, leaving Cape Esperance by night. The campaign concluded. The Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal complete. George himself was wounded on February 7th during operations near the Tanamboa River. The bullet struck his left shoulder, passed through muscle without hitting bone. He was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field and spent 2 weeks recovering. When he returned, the velocity of combat in Guadalcanal had moved on, and the sniper section's role diminished. In his debriefing, George reflected, the Winchester Model 70 had served admirably in the jungle sniper role, but the larger lesson was that modern warfare was shifting. Semi-automatic rifles and massed production arms were the future. Precision individual marksmanship was still vital, but the mass industrial scale of war had grown. When we left off, the battle for Guadalcanal had ended. John George, wounded but recovering, had helped create one of the first effective U.S. Army sniper sections of the Pacific War. His rifle, the Winchester Model 70 he had purchased with 2 years of National Guard pay, had proven itself in one of the deadliest sniper contests of the campaign. But George's war was far from over. While he recovered in the field hospital near Henderson Field, new orders began circulating through Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced jungle fighters, men who could operate independently, navigate impossible terrain, and fight with precision far behind Japanese lines. A new long-range penetration unit was being formed, patterned loosely after the British Chindits, who had raided deep into Burma. The unit had no official name yet, but the men would soon give themselves one that echoed across the Pacific. By March 1943, George received his orders. He was to transfer to India to join a new American unit, preparing for operations in the Burmese wilderness. The details were classified. Rumors whispered of missions hundreds of miles behind Japanese lines, weeks without resupply, operations that demanded absolute physical toughness and expert fieldcraft. It sounded like the kind of war he had already fought alone in the banyan trees, just scaled across an entire theater. George boarded a transport, his Winchester secured in a waterproof case. The Lyman Alaskan scope was wrapped carefully in oilcloth. The voyage took weeks. When he arrived in India on April 3rd, he found 200 other American officers waiting for the same briefing. The 307th Composite Unit, Provisional, would be its formal designation. 3 battalions, Approximately 3,000 men, equipped lightly, expected to march where no vehicles could follow and to fight where no supply lines could reach. Their mission? Fight through northern Burma and seize the critical Japanese-held airfield at Myitkyina, a linchpin of Japanese supply routes and a gateway for Allied aid flowing into China. It was, by any measure, one of the most demanding missions assigned to any American unit during the entire war. Training for the impossible. Training began in central India. The terrain was rugged, the heat unbearable, the humidity relentless. Instructors, American, British, and Chinese, taught jungle survival, long-range patrolling, ambush tactics, river crossings, and mule handling for the pack animals that would carry ammunition and radios. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion, not officially as a sniper. The Army had no such billet, but as a rifle platoon leader. But senior officers knew exactly who he was and what he had done at Point Cruz. His file and Colonel Ferry's endorsement had followed him across the Pacific. Men whispered that the quiet lieutenant with the battered civilian rifle had once hunted an entire Japanese sniper platoon through the jungle. Some dismissed it as legend. Others believed every word. George said nothing. He focused on preparing for Burma, modifying the Winchester for a long march. The Winchester had been perfect for Guadalcanal. Short stalks, static hides, and precision shots out to 300 yards in dense jungle. But Burma would be different. The marauders would march hundreds of miles over mountains and through jungles so thick they swallowed entire platoons. Every ounce of weight mattered. George made changes. He removed the Lyman Alaskan scope and replaced it with a lighter Weaver 330. Same 2.5x magnification, but 8 ounces lighter. He swapped the wooden stock for a synthetic one, cutting the rifle's weight to 8 pounds, 14 ounces. A pound saved on a rifle might not matter on a normal patrol, but on a 20-day march through mountains, burdened with 60 pounds of gear, while fighting disease, heat, and enemy patrols, it was the difference between endurance and collapse. The march into Burma. The marauders crossed the Burmese frontier on February 24th, 1944. Ahead lay rainforests, swamps, rivers, and mountains. Terrain the Japanese believed was impassable for a large, organized force. They were wrong, but they weren't entirely wrong about the cost. Within a week, the marauders marched 83 miles. Men began collapsing from exhaustion. Malaria cases spiked. The mules struggled in the mud. Some had to be shot when they broke legs on steep slopes. As they advanced deeper into Burma, George used the Winchester sparingly and never twice in the same engagement. The Japanese quickly learned to recognize the sharp, unique crack of the Model 70, distinct from the Garand. A second shot would reveal his position. He made them count. At a river crossing, he fired once at a Japanese officer 412 yards away, dropping him instantly. At 380 yards, he neutralized a machine gun crew pinning down a marauder column. At 290 yards, he sighted and eliminated a Japanese sniper who had pinned a patrol in dense jungle. 3 shots, 3 kills, no follow-up shots. George understood something few American officers at the time truly grasped. A sniper's job isn't to fire often. It's to fire only when the shot will matter. The Burma campaign grinds on. The marauders fought constantly that spring. 12 engagements in 30 days. Many were short, violent ambushes at ranges of 50 yards or less. Firefights erupted out of nowhere, lasting seconds before the jungle swallowed the combatants again. George rarely had opportunities for long-range shots. Still, The rifle stayed slung on his shoulder, ready for the rare moment when a distant silhouette or a fleeting movement at the edge of the tree line made it the right tool. By late May, the unit had marched over 700 miles. They had lost more men to disease than to bullets. Malaria, dysentery, typhus. Illnesses ran rampant. Men grew skeletal. Some had to be carried. Others refused to be carried, stumbling forward only out of stubbornness. On May 17th, the marauders seized Myitkyina airfield in a brutal assault, the first Allied capture of a major Japanese-held airbase in the Burma campaign. The mission had succeeded, but the unit was destroyed in the process. Of the original 3,000 marauders, fewer than 200 were fit for combat afterward. The rest were wounded, hospitalized, or gravely sick. George survived. The Winchester survived. But the rifle that had killed Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal had fired only 7 rounds in 3 months of operations. Modern jungle warfare demanded rapid ambushes, close-range fighting, and mobility, not long-range marksmanship. Still, when that rare long-range moment came, the Winchester had never failed him. An end to combat operations. By June 1944, the marauders were evacuated from Burma. The unit was disbanded. George was transferred back to the United States to serve as a training officer. He would never fire the Winchester Model 70 in combat again, but his experiences, Guadalcanal's lethal banyan groves, the creation of America's first elite sniper cadre, and the long, brutal march through Burma had shaped him. They would soon shape American military doctrine as well, and they would lead him, eventually, to write one of the most important books on infantry combat of World War II. When Merrill's marauders were pulled out of Burma in June 1944, the unit was shattered, more by exhaustion and disease than by Japanese bullets. The mission had succeeded. The airfield at Myitkyina was in American hands, but the price was almost the entire fighting strength of the 5307th Composite Unit. For John George, it marked a turning point. He had fought 2 radically different jungle campaigns, one as a lone marksman in the banyan groves of Guadalcanal, the other as a platoon leader in one of the most punishing long-range penetration missions of the war. He had survived when many did not. And now, at the age of 28, the Army had something different in mind for him. Returning home as a teacher of war, George was evacuated to the United States in July 1944. The Army promoted him to captain and assigned him to Fort Benning, Georgia, home of the infantry school. There, far from the sweltering jungles of the Pacific, George was given a new mission: teach the next generation of officers how to fight the war he had already survived. His lectures were not theoretical. He taught marksmanship from the perspective of a man who had killed snipers at 200 to 300 yards, using nothing but a low-powered scope and patience. He taught small unit tactics from the mindset of a leader who had moved platoons through Burmese jungle, so thick even sunlight struggled to penetrate. He taught the psychology of combat the way only a man who had lain half-submerged in a crater, waiting for enemy infantry to step into his sights, ever could. And unlike many instructors, George understood something profound about jungle warfare. The rifleman who adapts survives. The rifleman who refuses to adapt dies. He knew this because he had lived it. The Winchester retires from war. The Winchester Model 70, scarred, worn, but still precise, traveled with George back to Fort Benning. It sat in a footlocker in his quarters, cleaned meticulously after the Burma campaign, but no longer needed. By then, the war had changed dramatically. American forces were retaking islands across the Pacific. Amphibious operations, naval bombardments, and armored thrusts defined the movement of the front lines. On the other side of the world, U.S. troops were pushing into France and Germany. Entire divisions were engaged in mechanized warfare that looked nothing like the dense jungles of Guadalcanal or northern Burma. The individual marksman, with a hand-tuned rifle and deep experience, was becoming less central to the Army's grand strategy. Standardization was winning. Mass production was essential. An army could not equip millions of men with handcrafted rifles like the Winchester. It needed Garands, carbines, Thompsons, interchangeable weapons that could be repaired anywhere. George understood. He wasn't bitter, but he also sensed that something was being lost. He believed marksmanship was more than hitting a target. It was the mindset of patience, of precision, of discipline. The Winchester, in his view, represented something elemental, the idea that an individual rifleman, with skill and calm under pressure, could change the course of a battle. He knew this because he had done it. The war ends. A new life begins. John George was discharged from the Army in January 1947. His final rank was Lieutenant Colonel. His decorations included 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and the Combat Infantry Badge. He returned to Illinois, not as a soldier, but as a scholar. Thanks to the GI Bill, he enrolled at Princeton University to study politics. His classmates were young men starting their futures. George had already lived several lifetimes. He graduated with highest honors in 1950. Then he crossed the Atlantic to England, attending Oxford University for 4 more years. From there, he traveled to British East Africa, studying political systems and regional governance. He became a researcher, a writer, a thinker, his life shifting away from the sights of a rifle and toward the structures of nations. Eventually, he settled in Washington, D.C., working as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he became a consultant for the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute, lecturing on African political development. In the circles he moved in, academics, diplomats, policymakers, few people knew the details of his wartime service. They knew he had been in the Pacific. They knew he had been an infantry officer. But they did not know about Point Cruz. They did not know about 10 snipers killed in the banyan trees. They did not know about Merrill's marauders or the rifle that followed him through 2 campaigns. George rarely spoke of any of it. The book no one expected, but in 1947, shortly after leaving the Army, George felt compelled to record what had happened. Not for glory, not for entertainment, for accuracy. He believed that if he didn't document the weapons, the tactics, and the realities of jungle combat while they were still fresh in his mind, they would disappear. He wrote for 6 months, 400 pages, detailed technical analysis of Japanese rifles, ammunition, optics, observations about battlefield psychology, critiques of American training, accounts of small unit engagements, not by emotion, but by cold, unemotional description. A friend at the National Rifle Association read the manuscript and told him bluntly, "This must be published." George hesitated. It was technical, dense, nothing like the sensational war stories dominating post-war bookshelves. But eventually he agreed. The book was titled Shots Fired in Anger. It became, unexpectedly, a classic, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest, because it was precise, because it documented the realities of World War II small arms combat better than any other first-person American account at the time. Collectors, military historians, and competitive shooters still use it today as a reference. It remains one of the most respected books ever written about infantry weapons and jungle warfare. A life quietly lived. George lived long enough to watch the United States enter 3 more wars: Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. He watched rifles evolve from the Garand to the M14, and from the M14 to the M16. He watched sniping transform from an improvised craft to a formal military discipline with schools, doctrines, and highly advanced optics. The world had changed. Warfare had changed. The tools had changed. But the lessons he wrote in 1947, the lessons he learned in the trees above Point Cruz and the jungles of Burma, never stopped being relevant. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. The rifle that became a relic after his death, the rifle that had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee, to Guadalcanal, to India, to Burma, and back, was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits today in a display case behind glass. Most visitors walk past without noticing it. To them it looks like any other vintage hunting rifle: walnut stock, simple optic, blued steel. But those who know the story stop, because that rifle once cleared an entire grove of Japanese snipers in 4 days, when a battalion could not, because it once silenced men hidden 90 feet above the jungle floor, because it once proved that skill, discipline, and patience could outweigh doctrine, equipment, or rank, because it once changed the U.S. Army's understanding of what an individual marksman could do.